Okay, then here we go. My name is Stephanie Schorow, and I'm a writer in the Boston area. And here are some of my books that I've been writing. And I'm here to talk about the Great Boston Fire, the inferno that nearly incinerated the city. And you can tell I worked for the Boston Herald from that title. Okay, so here's the question. Why did I get interested in this darn fire? And I have to admit, it's for purely voyeuristic purposes. I was fascinated by the sheer scale of it. These are pictures of Boston downtown crossing after the fire. And these are unusual panoramic photos. The photographers of the day got these photos by getting up on the top of a building and shooting a multiple series of photos and created this wonderful panorama. And looking at this devastation, I just thought to myself, this is amazing. This is in the downtown crossing area where I go a lot. People don't know about this. I don't know about this. It looks like a disaster of nuclear proportion struck Boston. So I said, I've got to look into that. So that is the thing that got me into it. But there are lessons that we can take from this fire that apply to today. Now, I have to admit, Boston has had a lot of fires. Okay, and here are some of them. And the Great Boston Fire is not even the worst of them all. The worst fire probably in Boston history was the Coconut Grove Fire, because nearly 500 people died. But in terms of expanse and in terms of sheer magnitude, the Great Boston Fire was one of the greatest fires, if you want to use that word, in the 19th century. Now, at that time, fires were all over this country. So for me to say it was one of the biggest fires, it was in a pretty big crowd of fires. So there were many fires going on. And I think you know of one of them, the 1871 Chicago fire, which is celebrated in all kinds of ways. There's that camp song that we all used to sing, you know, late last night. Well, I can't sing. But anyway, Mrs. O'Leary's Cow has a great story. The soccer team today is called Chicago Fire. So it had there is a huge fire there, but in many ways, the Boston fire was more expensive per acre. It didn't kill as many people, but it was more expensive per acre. So people in Boston knew about this fire, and they thought, well, that couldn't happen here, not in the Athens of America. Certainly a big fire could happen in Cowtown in Chicago, but not here. So people were very complacent. So let me just set this up. So in 1872, there were about 250,000 people, and it was very busy as a city, a port city, and it was a center of commerce. And the city was understandably very proud of itself as the springboard for the revolution. And there were many reformers in the city at this time. So there was a lot of interest in outward social issues. By this time, slavery was abolished, but there are many reform movements. And so that was part of the heritage. But that very interest, that very hubris, blinded people to the possibility that all of it could go poof, up and smoke. So the downtown area, which we know is kind of where Washington and Summer Street meet. And now that had been a neighborhood. I mean, we think of it as a retail area. And in 1872, it had become a commerce and retail area. But just a few years earlier, just a few decades earlier, it was a neighborhood of gracious buildings and big homes. And so it had gradually turned into this land area for commerce. And the problem with that was the infrastructure. By that, I mean the water mains under those buildings were built for a residential neighborhood, not for buildings that were going to be the amazing height of 5 and 6 and even 7 stories. And that was pretty huge back in those days. These new buildings that were being built in the downtown area, I have to say, they weren't just your utilitarian warehouses going up. They were being built as temples to capitalism, sort of homages to the forces of commerce that were going on. So they had a lot of architecture embellishments. They had granite. They had something called the mansard roof, was made out of wood, it was on top. A lot of people said, oh, that's a fire hazard, but a lot of people liked the glamour of having a mansard roof on top of their building. Now, the other thing that played into this, and this is kind of ironic, but Boston had what was considered one of the best fire departments in the country at this time. And here's a picture of one of the companies here. Now, they had the latest in 19th century technology, which was a steam fire engine, which used coal or wood to produce pressure that would be, when you hooked a hose up to the fire engine, it produced pressure that could then get streams of water very effectively and efficiently on buildings. So the firefighters were very well trained in that. Some of them were professional, some were volunteer. The department was headed up by a John S. Damrell. He was called the chief engineer, but he was the chief of the department. And he insisted on the latest and the best equipment for his volunteers and for his professionals. And he was very insistent that the city be protected from fire. I should go over this. And he was very concerned about the flaws in the city. For one thing, he was concerned about those mains. He was concerned about those mansard roofs. And he was very, very concerned about the lack of fire stations right in that downtown area. Now, here's a map of it. Things look a little different today, but you can kind of get a sense of where the downtown area, this is the burnt area. And this is a picture of John Damrell. And he was, I think, a person that is a hero. He's actually a hero in Boston history. He's not that well known, but he is someone that we owe a real debt of gratitude to, including the entire country owes him a debt of gratitude. And like everyone else who looks into his life, you kind of fall in love with him, both men and women. He's just a great guy. But he was determined to make Boston a safe place to live, and that include being aware of the problems of fire. One thing about him, he had been an orphan. He kind of was a pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of guy. He'd been a builder and a carpenter, so he knew about buildings. He knew how to build things. So he was not anybody who would be reticent about saying, no, you shouldn't build it that way, because he knew all about it. And he was very determined to make sure that what happened in Chicago would not happen in Boston. In his annual reports, and I've looked at these reports, 1867, 1868, 69, and so on and so forth, he kept trying to point out the problems in Boston. He said there are problems with the hydrants, there are problems with the water system. He had this, there was one character flaw in John Damrell, and I believe it was that he felt that if he laid out the facts and just told people the truth, especially politicians, they would do the right thing. And he was wrong then, and we maybe face a little of that today. Because when he went to the city to say, hey, we've got a problem here, he was met with this statement: don't try to magnify the wants of your department or your office too much. In other words, don't make a big thing out of it, okay? All you're trying to do is enhance your position. And he was saying, no, I'm trying to make the city safer. And in fact, after Chicago, he went to that city to see for himself what had happened. And he talked to fire officials there, and he brought the money that had been raised for the families from Boston. And he looked around, and he said, the same conditions in this city could very well happen in Boston. Went back again. He went in front of the police, the fire officials, and the commissioners of the city, and said, we need to do something. And again, they said, yeah, okay, maybe later. And basically what he wanted to do went unheeded again. Now, the interesting thing about writing histories, and I don't know if anyone here write a history, any kind of local history, or interested in that. And I can't see you online, but wave your hands for each other if you've done that. But you'll notice there's a lot of little side traps that you can get into. In other words, you're going down one road and you say, hey, this is interesting, and you start looking into it, and suddenly you're down the rabbit hole. Well, I went down the rabbit hole for something was called the great horse epizootic, or it was a pandemic for equines. Little context, Boston was, all transportation this time was by horses. Everything was pulled by horses, or by, there were trains, of course, but personal trolleys, wagons, taxis, everything was horse. That was the real horsepower. And what happened in early of 1872, around October, a mysterious disease started to affect horses in Canada. And then it spread and it spread and it spread. They call it the horse plague, and it continued to go on. And again, I don't know about you, but having been through a pandemic just recently, I found some eerie parallels, because at first the people said, well, it's not going to come here. We don't have to worry about it. And then in the next week or so, boom, all their horses would be sick. Now, this was a basic flu for the horses. They didn't kill them. It just made them very, very sick. And they had all the symptoms of flu: watery eyes, dripping nose, fatigue. They just couldn't work. So they had to come up with other means to get things around. And this was devastating because, like, for some people, the horse was their only form of a transportation and or work. This is probably a picture of someone who used a horse for a taxi cab. This is an illustration of the spread of this horse flu. It started in Canada, north on the northern coast, on the eastern seaboard, and then it spread all the way through to California. And here's the thing, they didn't know what caused it. We still don't know what caused it. It was some kind of virus. In those days, they didn't even know what a virus was. So there were all these fantastic ideas of what could be causing this flu. And because it was delayed, because a horse could get infected, but it would be a couple of days before they would show symptoms, it was very easily spread. Again, parallels to today. And what some researchers found out is that the horse flu was spread by railroads, because horses who seemingly were well were put on railroad tracks and taken to the next destination, where they would immediately start getting sick and infect the next group of horses. And so it spread across the country. Now, this meant that people were doing their own work in terms of pulling wagons and all kinds of things. In fact, this was a big thing in the city of Boston. People were pulling trolleys that were pulling people. And there was even an effort to increase anti-cruelty measures to horses. There was a kind of a burgeoning animal welfare movement. In fact, Angel Memorial, just right around the corner here, a guy, Roger Angel, I think, started that. He had a newspaper called Our Dumb Animals, Our Dumb Friends, or something like that. And he didn't mean it in a pejorative way. He meant that they can't speak for themselves. But that newspaper contained a lot of stories about the horse flu and about the tragedies. Because, like I said, not all the horses died, but a number of them did. So it was a very difficult thing. Now, just put a little end mark on that. The flu disappeared after a while. It got well, disappeared. It's never come back. So we still don't know what it was. Two reasons. One, horses got some kind of immunity to it, or two, we stopped using horses. So that particular flu just died out because we didn't have horses. Now, looking at the situation of Boston, you'd say, well, the horses were awful, but what does that have to do to fire? Well, horses, very, very specially trained horses, pulled those steam fire engines. They're very heavy. They used to be pulled by men before they got so heavy, and then it was horses. These horses were extremely well trained. They could stand. When they heard the bell, they'd go right to their stall, and the halters would drop on them, and they'd take off the fire. They would not run from fires. They were very calm. So they were beloved comrades to the firefighters. And now the horses had all gotten sick. So Damerel was faced with the situation where if a fire breaks out, how are we going to get to it without using horses? And he came up with a plan that basically stopped sending out as many engines to a fire. He said, well, we'll just put out the minimum and they'll be pulled by men. So there'll be some delay, but we won't keep anything uncovered. So he had this elaborate plan and it seemed to be working. Now, here's the deal. People always say, well, what caused the fire? What actually was the spark? And I'm saying that's the wrong question to ask. It's not what caused it. Fires happened all the time during this time. There were fires almost daily in the city of Boston and around the country. The issue with the Great Boston Fire is that it was an entire systems failure. And if we look at it through a lens of a system, then we can get greater insights to it. And it wasn't a cow, by the way, kicking over a butt. So unfortunately, we don't have a really cool story, but we do have that it started in a building here in Kingston and Summer Street about 7 p.m. on Saturday night, November 9th, 1872. Remember, it was dark by that time. This area, because it was commercial and retail and wholesale, it's pretty much deserted. So there were a few people walking around, but not very many. And at that time, there was an elaborate fire alarm system in Boston, which was quite good. It was based on the telegraph because they didn't have like the system that we have today. And so it had boxes all over the city that would alert the fire alarm headquarters of where a fire was. The headquarters would say, okay, box 52 rang. Well, let's tell the city where that is. And they'd ring out the church bells, the city bells, which would ring out 5, 2, 5 strikes, 2 strikes. And then firefighters, oh, that's box 52. And we know where that was. And most of the firefighters knew exactly where every box was in the city. One problem, these boxes were kept locked because they didn't want people turning in false alarms. So there was usually a little bit of delay because a policeman had a key and somebody and a shop owner had a key, but there's a delay, there would be a delay. And this is what happened with this fire, that the fire was actually seen right about 7 o'clock. People saw fire in that building, started screaming, yelling, fire, fire, went around and tried to get people's attention, but the actual alarm that brought firefighters in didn't go out till 7:24. There was a second alarm, a third, and the fourth alarm, which went out at 7:45, brought in every engine company in the city. The men came dragging their engines because the horses were sick. Now that may not seem like a lot of time. And the men were delayed, not as much as you think. I mean, having the men drag the engines didn't delay it as much as you might think, given the power of horses, but there was some delay. And in this time, the fire started to get out of control. And basically, the fire started to spread. And after that first building was totally engulfed, it was almost impossible to stop it because of a couple things. One, the heat that it generated. These buildings were all filled with wholesale material. It was right before Christmas, so there was a lot. They're filled with material. The mansard roofs, which were wooden, which catch on fire, and so fire spread from roof to roof. And I think, as you can see in this particular illustration, see the streams of the fire engines. The best way to fight a fire in those days was to get water on the top, put it down, but the streams could not reach that high, partly because the water mains in this area were not big enough. They had been made for a residential area. So everything that Damerel said was coming to pass. And as you can see here, the fire often spread roof to roof, making it extremely hard for the firefighters to attack it. Damerel was doing his best. He was bringing out everybody in the city. He was calling in fire companies from all over the area, but the fire was simply relentless. And we don't have any photographs of the actual fire. There are no photographs. Photography was not advanced enough to actually have fires, to have photos taken at night and this kind of thing. However, there are a lot of lithographs and a lot of illustrations. So we can actually get an idea of what this fire looked at. And you can kind of see this scene. This is the old Trinity Church. And I'll draw your attention to a couple things. Not only were there fire engines and fire companies there and people fighting fire, but it's filled with people, filled with onlookers. Because, hey, fire was entertainment. It was a big fire. You went out to see it. So there was that. So a lot of onlookers. There were also many people trying to rescue their material from their buildings and stores. They're trying to bring out all their goods. They're trying to get to their safes, to get out their papers. And so it was an absolute madhouse of people trying to get their material out, firefighters trying to fight the fire, and a lot of people just out to gawk at the fire. What made it even worse is that a number of merchants managed to load up some of their stuff, but they realized in a few minutes they weren't going to get it out, so they started giving it away. So a lot of people, the police and the fire could not tell the difference between people who were looting and people who were just taking advantage of a giveaway. Here's a kind of a illustration of how the fire spread, and you can see it starts in the bottom corner there, and then sort of relentlessly spreads through the city. It spread right to the water. Now, if you're comparing it to today, I'll just show you this. You can't, because the streets are all different, but you can kind of see that it burned right to the water. And if there hadn't been an ocean there, it would have kept on burning. So it was pretty difficult to keep it under control. Here's a really great view of it. The fire could be seen out at sea for like 200 miles because it was so bright. And it became so hot that it became what they would call a hurricane of fire. In other words, so crazy hot that it created its own winds. So it actually would start swirling around and would go against the wind because it was just creating its own kind of currents. The fire, the people in the area, the politicians and the newspaper people, there were a lot of newspaper people that were covering this, called it the fire fiend. And this is, I think, a good illustration of the fire fiend. And here are some other illustrations of the fire. And you can get a sense of how dramatic it was. This is a great image. This is from the cover of Harper's Magazine, and this shows the firefighters in action. It's very romanticized, and yet I like it because it really shows the determination of this group of firefighters and the fear that was in their eye. Now, if you can imagine fighting this huge hurricane of fire, you don't have the equipment they have today. You don't have the helmets, you don't have the breathing apparatus, you don't even have the clothes. So you are, all that's between you and this fiend of fire is a hose with water that continually ran out. Because the mains were so small, firefighters were running. Not only could they not get water up on the top of the building, but the water would often run out. So when that happened, there was nothing they could do. They had to back up and try to establish another point to attack the fire. So it was a kind of a fight all through that night. One of the interesting things about this this book for me was I'd written about the fire before in my first book, Boston Fire. But in this book, I had one thing I didn't have when I did the other one, and that was the internet. So I was able to do searches, and I found some really interesting stories about people who witnessed the fire, including Louisa May Alcott, to my surprise. And she was living up on Beacon Hill at the time, and author of Little Women, had this great story that she wrote to her sister about going down. She, like everyone else, went down to look at the fire and see what was going on. And you can read one of her quotes here: the red glare, the strange roar, the flying people all made the night terrible. And I kept thinking of the last day of Pompeii. So what you had was people like her, like William Lloyd Garrison. By the way, William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, he was a bit of a spark. He loved going to fires. He really enjoyed going out to them, because there's a lot of references in his letters and things that he went out to look at fires. And then there's this very heartbreaking story about Alexander Graham Bell, who was 25 at the time, and he went out, and with many volunteers, he went out to help. He went and tried to help the fire, and he wrote apparently a description of this that he sent to the Boston Globe, and he told his family, look for it, look for it. Guess what? Guess which paper did not print the words of Alexander Graham Bell? The Globe, the Boston Globe. And I just think it's funny, as it's lost. He probably didn't keep a copy of it, but it's very sad, because I really would have been curious of what he had to say, because I'm sure he was affected by it. One thing that was happening, as I mentioned, is that Damrell had called for help from all over New England. So fire engines were loaded up on trains and brought into Boston. So there were fire companies from New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, I think Rhode Island, but definitely from New Hampshire and Maine. Someone came as far as Maine, came down to fight this fire, and including one very famous engine called the Kearsarge. I mean, in those days, they named their engine companies. So there was a company called the Kearsarge that came down from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and it's credited for helping to save the Old South Meeting House, because the fire had crept up very close to it. And just as it seemed like all was lost, this fire engine came in, had freshmen, they were all raring to go, and they managed to get water onto the Old South and managed to save it. And that's the only reason we have that Old South today, because it was saved in the nick of time. There's some dispute about whether the role of the Kearsarge, but the sources I have would indicate that it did come down and help save the Old South. So the fire was eventually put out. It took concerted efforts. You can see basically Damrell amassed his forces that were buttressed by all these companies coming from other parts of the New England, and they managed to make a stand and just basically said, you will not pass. You won't go farther than this. So they were able to do that. One thing I'll mention very quickly, there was some use of dynamite. Basically, some buildings were blown up to create a fire block so the fire couldn't jump over it. And you see that's a technique that they use today. In forest fires, they'll actually burn an area so they prevents it from spreading. But in this case, the dynamite just didn't really work, because the fire was so powerful, it sort of jumped over these fire breaks. And there was one other problem, and this again speaks to the issue of a systems failure. At this point, Boston had gas lights. Everyone had gas. That's how they lit their houses, from gas, opposed to the candles and the other things. And the gas mains, the mains could not be turned off block by block. It could only be turned off to the whole city. And so there was a delay and a problem in getting to the gas headquarters and getting the gas turned off. So what happened is that a building would burn or be blown up, and the gas would continue to flow out, and then it would ignite and blow up, and it would spread the fire. So it took them a while to turn off the gas, and it plunged the whole city into darkness. But that, again, a system failure not to have a way to turn off the gas block by block. The fire most of it was out by Sunday night, but then another part of it broke out on Monday, and there was another sort of burning area. And then finally by Monday morning, it was out. And this is, it's funny, but you might think, well, that's the end of my story, but it's not. There's a lot more to tell about this fire even after it went out. Because one of the things that it did was it became the area they called the burn district became almost a tourist attraction. And it was covered by newspapers all over the world. So it became a world event, and many people flocked to see what had happened to Boston. Here's some pictures. Here's another map from Harper's that shows the extent of it. The tally of it, let's just give you an idea, was 776 buildings and 60 acres. About 20,000 people were left homeless, maybe 10 million in consigned goods. In other words, so much goods, services, arts, books, a lot of collections were burned up. the saddest part is that 11 firefighters and one former firefighter, a volunteer, were killed, died in the fire. And that's a pretty high death toll for the fire department. And again, you can't imagine the bravery of these men trying to face this absolute fiend of a fire. In terms of other deaths, we don't really have a good death toll. This was not kept very well. And this is kind of characteristic of this time, but I've estimated, and this is my estimate, between 20 and 30 people in addition to the firefighters, or not more than that. I mean, I've looked through sources, looked at names, and it wasn't kept the figures weren't kept very well. And a lot of people were buried in the rubble, and they didn't know about them. So it's hard to say how many people were killed. But while it was a high death toll for firefighters, it was a low death toll in terms of civilians. Chicago fire killed about 250 to 300 people. So you can see that this is another one of the reasons why this fire is not particularly well known outside the Boston area, because the death toll was so low that it didn't get astronomical. The firefighters, though, like I said, I just want to show you something about them, because some of them were buried under buildings. In one case, the two Abbotts were brothers that were associated with the Charlestown Fire Department, and both of them died. And it was heartbreaking for their family and their mother on that. And there was some question of someone from New Haven dying. It's a little unclear. The newspapers had a lot of information, but it was sometimes very hard to parse out what was actually accurate or not. This is a kind of a famous illustration by Thomas Nast, who was the editorial political cartoonist that you all know, because he was the one who used the elephant for the Republicans and the Democrats, the donkey for the Democrats. He was the one who did that first. And so we followed with that. Now, another story, another rabbit hole that I went down in covering this, is that the fire, like I said, attracted a lot of tourists, came to look at it, disaster tourism, we've seen that. But it also attracted a lot of photographers, some of the best photographers of the day, landscape photographers, who lived in Boston or from there, rushed to get pictures, photos of the devastation. Part of it was just a journalistic impulse to record it, but also people like to collect these photos. They like to have them. Here's a very dramatic photo. You can see this at the Boston Public Library has a number of these photos on the Flickr, it's Flickr site, or you could see them. And this was another reason I wrote this book, because I would look through these photos, and they're all up there, and they're clear, they're crisp, they really bring you to that moment. And they're almost, every time I look at them, I'm mesmerized by what the photographers were able to capture there. And these photos served a number of purposes, because when the World, Harper's, and other magazines wanted to cover this story, at this time, papers or newspapers, periodic could not reproduce photos. They didn't have the technology. But what they did was they get photos sent to them, and then they'd reproduce it in terms of an illustration. So you can see on one side here is as a photo, and the other side is the artist's rendition of it, almost exactly. And a lot of these you can kind of match up the photos and to the illustrations. Black's panorama of the city, for example, Mr. Black was a famous photographer, very well known, and he did this panorama, and this is it made into a lithograph, which was printed. And the original, he also made a lot of originals, and William Lloyd Garrison talks about getting a copy of it, the panorama, and was talking about how delighted he was. It was great. It was a great thing to have. Like I said, he really was a spark. But there was one other commercial opportunity that came out of the Great Boston Fire, and that was something called stereoscopes, or stereoscopic cards. And that was the creation of a sense of 3D by positioning two photos. And so your eye sees the two images, and it creates a 3D effect. And so many of the images of this fire were turned into these stereographic cards. And these cards, everyone, if you had like an old master, what do they call them, whiz masters? Viewmasters, there you go. Thank you very much. Viewmasters, it's the same idea. You plug it in and you look at it through an invention, by the way, that Oliver Wendell Holmes developed. You would get this 3D effect. Now, to our eyes, it doesn't look so great, but for them, it was a form of entertainment. In fact, parlor games, the Victorian people would get together and look at images. Now, most of the time they're looking at travel images, and they're looking at flowers, and looking at scenes from Greece or from different beautiful sceneries. And here they're looking at many, many scenes of destruction. And when I first came across these images, and there are a lot of them, I got all these on, these are all from my collection. I bought them all on eBay, another great source. So I had, I collect a lot of them. And I said, what is with these people? I don't want to see these scenes of destruction. This is pretty awful. And then I realized, have you watched the movies lately, Stephanie? And, you know, everything is getting blown up. And so the idea of destruction that's far from you, that you could enjoy from the distance, is kind of a human trait. So these are the disaster movies of their day. Some of the things that also commercial opportunities was the selling of relics. People collected things from the fire and sold them. And I had the opportunity once of speaking at the Hingham Fire Museum, and they brought out a box and they said, these are things we think came from the Great Boston Fire, and just a collection of different items here, including some letters. I thought, wow, this is cool. So people saved a lot of that. And there's probably more of those hanging around that been either handed across or people threw them out after a while. Now, the city itself, of course, was shocked. People were devastated. A lot of businesses were ruined. A lot of people were ruined. But a lot of businesses had insurance. It didn't pay everything, but it paid a lot. And a lot of people just got right back up and went back to work. And this is an example of that they went to where their store was and said, here's where we moved to. So if you're coming here looking for us, here's where we are. And they set up forms of business. One of the things that was really important were the safes. A lot of these people had material in safes in their building. And so the first thing they did was to go there and open the safes, see if anything survived. And in some cases, things survived. And in other cases, like silver was melted into a mass and papers were burned up. But a number of safes actually did survive the fire. And of course, this made for a great commercial opportunity, because in this pamphlet that came out just a couple weeks after the fire, they had an advertisement from Morris and Ireland Safes, which survived the Great Boston Fire. And all this, you can't see this, but these are all testimonial from people saying, dear sirs, my company property was protected by your fine safes through this fire. So where other people spelled disaster, Morris and Ireland spelled a sales opportunity. And so the Boston actually rebuilt fairly quickly. It was actually not that hard to get the wheels of commerce back turning. Like I said, a number of people were covered by insurance. Other people weren't. A lot of people were ruined. But there was a certain effort to just get back to normal. And so a year, 2 years later, 3 years later, the area was rebuilt. There was a real effort to straighten the streets, make it a modern kind of downtown, and that went nowhere. So I don't know if you've driven down there, the streets are all crazy. I think some of them widened, but they didn't really straighten them out. So things started being put together. There's one other important thing. Who's to blame? What's the problem? Who actually should we point a finger to for this fire? And Boston, as its wont, convened a commission that went on for a very long time, heard testimony for hundreds and hundreds of people, including John Dammel, the fire chief. and literally hundreds of witnesses. I've looked through most of the testimony. A lot of it's contradictory, but a lot of it gives you an idea of how the fire went. And in their conclusions, who do you think they blamed for the fire? Damrell got the brunt of it, even though he was the one who was saying we should be doing something on it. And it was interesting, one of the things he was faulted for, which I think was a very telling thing, he was faulted for being at the front of the fire. He went out and was with the men. He stayed with them. He went from place to place. He was out there. And several people had said, no, we wanted you to stand back and be a general and command from a central point. And there is some validity to the idea that you have somebody centrally dictating or commanding all this stuff, but Damrell really felt that his role, his position was to be out there with his men, and they're all men at that time, on the fire line. So he was determined to be out there, but he got faulted by it. I had a long talk with Paul Christian, who was a former former fire and fire commissioner and fire chief in Boston. And we talked, he had studied this fire, he was very interested in Damrell. And he says, no, I think Damrell did the right thing. I would not fault him. The only fault I would have is that when the fire originally, when the alarms went out, they didn't have as many people out there at the initial outbreak. That might have made a difference. But he says, no, I think he fought it pretty well. And he actually, it was eventually stopped, even though it burned up a lot of the area. Now, the result of this fire, obviously, there's been a lot of changes since then. It did not come right away. I mean, looking over this, you would think that by the next year they would have all sorts of rules in place, but no, the city had to suffer a couple more of these conflagrations, big fires, for them to really make some big differences. But eventually there was greater attention to the issues of building and zoning, and the idea that you should prevent a fire. I mean, there's something to be said for the way you build things so that you don't have fires, not just putting it on the back end in fighting fires. Finally there were a number of rules, regulations, mostly zoning, building materials regulations that were put into effect. It took a while, but here's the interesting thing. Damrell, as I said, was blamed for the fire. He had the full support of his men. His men all stood behind him. He did get reelected, and the fire chiefs in those days were reelected. He was reelected to another term, but then the city council decides to reorganize the fire department. Again, they're blaming the fire department as opposed to the infrastructure, which was the real culprit. So Damrell says, I'm resigning. So he's out of there. Now, he could have gone back to being a builder. He could have just gone back and retired, but instead he founds what will come to be called the International Association of Fire Chiefs. And that was a national and international organizations that brought together fire chiefs that looked at some of these issues about fire and fire safety. And it's still in place today. And he helped to get his ideas about fire prevention all around the country. In fact, there is a documentary on the 1872 fire called Damrell's Fire, and the director of that documentary, who actually we've had a lot of conversations about that, said, this was the guy who really helped to stop America from burning down. All these 19th century fires were a big deal, and he played a role in keeping that from happening. He also did something else interesting. He became the chief of the city's department, building inspection. He was basically the first building inspector. And he stayed in that job for the next 25 years, and then his son succeeded him. So instead of putting his tail between his legs and running off, he stuck with it. He stuck with trying to make the city safer, not as a firefighter now, but as someone who works with the codes. He even helped with this thing called the National Model Building Code, which was something, it went into effect after he died, but it's something that was very, very influential. So he had this outsized effect on firefighting and fire prevention throughout the country. This is his grave. He's buried in Forest Hills, and right off of where the fireman's lot is, or firefighter's lot is. One other kind of story, interesting thing, the Kearsarge. Remember I was telling you about that? Well, a lot of fire engines were trashed when they got gasoline powered. They were let go, and a lot of disappeared, but some were saved, and the Kearsarge was eventually saved and restored. And it's actually been fully restored. And a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago, I'm a member of the Boston Fire Historical Society, and we brought the Kearsarge back to the spot where it may have saved the old, there it is at the Old South Meeting House. And this wonderful steampunk kind of machine was on display in downtown Boston for a while. And I would dearly love to bring it back. I really want to make contact with the Portsmouth Fire Department, because it basically, the machine languished in storage for a very long time. Then it's been purchased by a private owner who has had it restored, and it's back in Portsmouth, and it's a beautiful machine. It's really, I'm not big on machinery, but it's really gorgeous and really fun to look at. And I think it's something it's a good teaching tool to show people how technology emerges and changes, and it's can be different kinds of life-saving equipment. Here's another picture of it. That's the way it looks. I think it's been even more restored right now. Another thing, if you go around Boston, you'll find that there's still a box 52. Box 52 was the box in which the first notice of the fire went out. And there's been something called the Box 52 Association, which is a firefighting sparks organization. But here it is in downtown Boston. And it's actually not number 52, it's been renumbered, but they still have the number 52 on it, and has a special marker. And it's at the corner of Bedford and Summer Street, Kingston. It's like in a weird intersection there, but you can go see it. It's still there. And only firefighters really understand the significance of it, because they know Box 52. I mean, that's something that's very up in their memory. There are I didn't see, there used to be historical markers around. I don't see any anymore. They disappeared. So there's really very little that marks this Great Boston Fire. And of course, we're coming up on the 150th anniversary, so it's worth repeating. And of course, the Old South still stands here at the corner there. Now, I want to end very briefly, and I would have this more organized, but I had to run in because of the orange line. So we grab this. And I have to say, I do have books for sale, and I'll get them out. But I want to just finish by reading a little excerpt from the book that I think you'll find interesting. It's from the introduction, and it's about how we look at disasters, potential disasters, and what we do about it. So, the past, as William Faulkner tells us, is never really dead. It's not even past. As I began this book, massive bushfires fueled by global warming swept through Australia. In the US, the Camp Fire wiped out the town of Paradise, California, and brutal forest fires returned the next year, and every year since then. In fact, the 19th century urban fires have been replaced by the 21st century wildland fire as a menace. So it's kind of, it's a different problem, different situation, but another disaster. So we can say that the fire fiend has not disappeared. It's just taking other forms. And there are modern dam wells. Young Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has endured ridicule to declare that our house, the earth, is on fire, and we must rush to the rescue. And then, COVID-19 reference, in late 2019, a Chinese physician, Dr. Li Wenliang, attempted to warn Wuhan area hospitals about the spread of a deadly new virus. He was instructed by police to keep his concerns to himself, and he later succumbed to COVID-19, among the first of the millions who died worldwide. We still refuse to listen to those who warn of possibilities and consequence. The whistleblowers, the Cassandras, the prophets of doom. Don't magnify the situation so much, we say. What do you know about it anyway? It can't happen here. Don't tell me to wear a mask against my will. Lighten up. Boston didn't listen to John S. Damrell, a man who tried to tell the city that it faced a monumental disaster and who bore the brunt of the blame for what happened. He would understand the dilemma of those who warn us of the unimaginable and whom we ignore until a strange light wakes us from sleep and we open the door to a furnace. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. For those in here, I do have books for sale. For those who aren't here, you can go to your local bookstore, go to Amazon. I will donate a copy to the library here so you can get it here. And people always ask, what are you doing next? Well, I've updated my book on the Coconut Grove nightclub fire for those who are familiar with it. And I found a lot of things new about it. And I found a lot of things that have been said about it were wrong, including my previous book on it. So I'm trying to rewrite it and get the truth out. So thank you very much for your attention.